My name is Maralee Mclean, and my story is about sexual abuse of my child and fighting in the court system trying to protect her. The more I fought the system, the more time they gave her with her father. I had lots of media coverage. There was physical evidence. There was proof that she was being abused. So I began fighting when I testified before Congress, and I realized there are other mothers going through the same thing. I ended up losing her to the father at the age of 4.5, I think 5, even with all the evidence and proof with the top doctors in the state of Colorado with Children's Hospital stating that she was being abused and had physical evidence. And the judge wouldn't listen to any of that evidence. He threw it out of the courtroom. I was in a domestic violence relationship, marriage. Back in those days, women didn't really know what domestic violence was. There was more emotional abuse, but there was everything physical. And at the time that I had my little girl, the father was not present while I was pregnant. He was taking money out of the account when she was born. At the time that I was going to divorce him after she was born, that time I had full custody of her. And as time went on, he didn't even care to see her. He wasn't involved in her life. He wouldn't even, some of his visits even show up. Once the abuse started, she was 2.5 years old. I had taken her to the daycare provider, and she told me that my daughter was doing some things at the daycare were worrisome about abuse. And she described what she was doing in a playhouse with another little boy. It was totally describing sexual abuse, what she asked him to do. I thought, well, she's getting that from that family, that boy's family, because I knew nothing would be going on. And I never would have believed he would have done anything like this. And when she discloses, I'm in shock that this is even happening. So I call my sister, who's a nurse at Children's Hospital, and I tell her what my daughter's saying. And she said, don't mention the father's name. Just keep her as calm as you can. In the morning when she wakes up, see if she repeats the same thing. And she did. It was explicit, detailed information. My sister told me to take her to her pediatrician, which I did. And that is where my nightmare begins. So social services gets involved, and he's the perfect father. He's good looking, he's charming, he's educated, very, very smart. So in those days, they didn't want to believe a father would rape his own child. And then there's a GAL that gets hired, which is a guardian ad litem, the lawyer for the child. And the first time she meets me is at social services. And she meets me with disdain. And she says, I have 4 things I want to discuss with you. But she wants me to go in the room and discuss these 4 things. And I'm thinking, I've already been through so much trying to protect her. She's been in with a therapist. The therapist tells me, yes, she's being abused. And so I just think they'll do the right thing. I mean, it's, they'll protect the child. He had a diary that he kept, and I never looked at that diary until this abuse started. And he wrote in there about my daughter when she's little. He wrote, I sip my sherry and wait for the moments that we'll be together again. And your lips met mine and your eyes were wide open. So he's saying really sick stuff. And I'm like, oh my God. And he wrote in there how he has demons inside of him that are clawing at his insides and they howl. So I went to a therapist for the first time in my life. She was very worried for my life. And she said, what are you doing to protect yourself? And do you have a gun? And I'm like, whoa. And I thought she over-exaggerated. He's done some horrific things, but he would never hurt her. Well, I was wrong. When she was born, I'd already admitted to myself and had already hired an attorney that I was going to divorce him within 6 months. Once that started, he got much worse. While I was going through all this, I'm trying to raise my little girl and he's not seeing her. Her daycare provider, she brought it forward to me. She said what my daughter was saying, describing sexual abuse, that no child should be able to know. Then within about 2 weeks, 3 weeks of that time, she disclosed to me what was happening to her. That was that denial thing again. I just didn't want to believe that he would have done anything to her to make her react to the way she was. I was told to take her to a therapist that knew this kind of thing. And I took her to this doctor who's supposed to be really good that the police department had recommended. And the last visit, she comes out and she hands me a document that she had written and looked me in the eye and said, yes, she's being abused. Within days of that, that's when social services got involved. Now, I kid you not, I'm looking through this little window at him with my daughter. And I think, oh my God, they're not going to see through this, because I could look at the social worker and she was in awe of him. So within a few times of visits supervised like that, I'm met by a GAL and she meets me with disdain. She's never met me before. She knows nothing about me. She's never been to my home. She's never interviewed my daughter and just believed everything he said. And I was interrogated like nothing you've ever seen on TV. Why would your daughter continue to say this if you weren't coaching her? Well, because maybe it's going on. I said, said, what about the doctor's report, Dr. Baker's report? She says, Dr. Baker does not state there's any kind of abuse. And I'm thinking, oh my God, am I going crazy? She said, this is parental alienation syndrome. Now, I never heard that term before. I've been over backwards for this man to be in her life. I had a great relationship with my own father, and I want her to have a chance to have the same. She had a foster care home lined up before I even walked in that morning. I couldn't believe what was happening. Honestly, it was like the most excruciating pain a mother can possibly go through. I laid my head down on a desk and I was sobbing. It still makes me cry. And they said to me, you can go say goodbye to your daughter now. I held it together because I knew, I cried right then. But as I was walking down the hallway, I knew if I didn't hold it together, they were going to completely take her away from me. So I'm walking down this hallway and they're whispering in the background, joking around, saying she can't do this. And I just put my hand out to the side and I said, oh, yes, I can. And I went in to my little girl. She saw that I'd been crying and she said, Mommy, and I said, everything's fine. I have to go to work. And then they had the police escort me out. And at that point, I got in my car, probably drove 100 miles an hour to Dr. Baker's office. And I called my mom and was sobbing, and my mom and dad got in the car, and about 2 a.m, they showed up at my door. And I've never been so glad to see my parents. I didn't even get to see her. She was in foster care and I didn't know where she was. And so that GAL said she'd meet me at a park one day. And so I met her at this park. My daughter was there and my daughter comes running across the park and the father's with the GAL. So he's already worked her. She was on the case probably 5 months before I even knew she was on the case. So she never met me. And then when the GAL went to put her in the car with me, she turned her head away from me. The night before she was crying and she said, Mommy, we'll always be together. And I thought that was really strange. I said, yes, always. We'll always be together. And she kept saying, well, are we going to be together? Of course, we'll always be together. So I don't know if her father was telling her things to think that or whatever. That next day is when they took her away from me. And the GAL puts her in the car and she turns her head when I go to kiss her. And I whispered to her, we'll always be together. At those visits, at one point, the daycare provider was exhausted because she was crying out all night for her mommy. And I'd go to those visits and she couldn't understand why I wasn't taking her home. So she'd turn around and face the wall. And then at that point, there were visitations with the father. And she actually said, Daddy, you're not to touch me here anymore. And she pointed to her vagina. Everything that was done on those visits, the daycare provider wrote down. They're going to put her in another foster care parent. She said, you do that and it will kill this baby. She needs to be home with her mother. So they finally decided to put her in my home. But I'm not allowed to bring up the abuse again. And if I do, I would lose her completely. My daughter's telling everybody what's happening to her. She's told policemen. She's told doctors. She told the social workers, she told me, my friends, she was talking. So as an adult, if you can't understand it, how does a child understand it? So this woman was totally in favor of the father, and that's what I saw a lot. She gets to come back home. And this was after the daycare provider had said she needs to be in her home, and she did get to come home, but I'm not allowed to bring up the abuse. But she's still going through the abuse. And she'd come home with a visit from him, and she'd hide under the dining room table. And she came out and said that her dad was still touching her. And I said, I'm sorry, honey. I'm doing everything I can to stop this. Well, could you hit his hands for me? And she's crying out with this abuse every night in her sleep, and it's horrific. A policeman is called out, and he comes to my home, and he's a police detective that handles sexual abuse cases. And within a few minutes, she told him everything, things she had never told me. She felt very close to him. I sat in the background, never said a word, and he had a drawing of a male and a female, and he said, has anybody ever touched you in a way that felt uncomfortable? She drew a circle on both areas, and then she said it was his peanut. That's what she called his peanut. I have to pay a court order. I have to pay for an attorney several $1,000s to get her into Children's Hospital for an evaluation. And they do find evidence of her being abused. They write a letter to my judge concerning the sexual abuse, and the judge ignores it and throws it out. And she'd say, Mommy, who are the good people? Who are the bad people? When I lost custody of her, I got the media involved, and they were asking for help and to get the DA involved. Just more and more evidence came out, and the more evidence, like I said, the more time they gave her with her father, which is crazy, I know. But once I was with my attorney, I saw the GAL passing a book under the table, and I just caught a glimpse of it. It was done by Richard Gardner, Dr. Richard Gardner. Gardner's the one that started the parental alienation syndrome. He's a pedophile. He stated in his own books, we all have some pedophilia within us. that it makes little girls and little boys better sexual partner. And he was able to push his ideas out there to all the courts. And they took on his theories. So it was really difficult because I was finding everything out. So when I read it, I went, oh my God, this is what they're using. So I took it to my attorney and I said, this is what they're using. I underlined everything that was actually happening and how they were using it against me and not protecting my daughter. Guess what happened? Judge thought what happens in these cases is parental alienation is worse than abuse. So in their eyes, I was doing the worst thing I could do to my daughter. So they gave him custody. And I went through supervised visits for 8 years, treated as a hardened criminal, where I got to see my daughter an hour a week. And it went to 2 hours in a little 8 by 10 foot room. During those supervised visits, I watched my daughter change drastically. She went into a trance-like state. I was like a therapist for that hour, just trying to give her as much as I could give her to keep her hanging on. She would lie on the floor at one point and she said, I can't see you. And I said, yes, you can. She goes, I can't see you. I want to die. And that's where she was going, and there was nothing in the world I could do about it. The supervisor of our visits never wrote all this stuff down. It was more painful than anything you can imagine for her and for me. But I kept that connection going because I didn't want to lose her, and I wanted her to know that I'm there fighting. Every time I came home, and if there was a police car on my street, I thought they're bringing her home. And the suffering is unbelievable. And the only way I got her home was through the media. They showed the doctor's reports and the police reports, and they did a great job. She could never understand why she couldn't come home. She could go down the park by my house, but she couldn't come home. She said, why can't I come home? And so when she finally got to come home, it was very gradual. And the first visit I had where she came home, I had 2 supervisors here, like I was a criminal. My sister was really close to her. And at one point, she was here visiting, and he told me I had to get her out of my house, that she couldn't be there when my daughter came home. And my daughter went up to the car where my sister was and put her hand on the window, and my sister put her hand on the window back. It was just crazy. It's like crazy making. I went through a lot of hearings, so you need to know, and a lot of judges, and all passing the buck to the next judge and not looking at the evidence, throwing it out like the last judge I had threw it out, ordered me to pay child support higher than he ever paid me, ordered me to pay all court costs, all therapists. In other words, they bankrupt you. So that's what happens to all these women. So I ended up going pro se on my last hearing, representing myself. I think I did better than most of my attorneys because I had a voice for the first time. I never had a voice in the courtroom. Now I was able to say things that I was never able to say. It was scary for me because they'd taken her away from me so many times that I just didn't believe it was real. She was finally home. She was so happy and so relieved. Even Christmases, I had to fight, on a supervised visit at Easter. She just wants to come home and look for eggs in her backyard and have anything normal. She has no normal life. I was not allowed to go to her school. I was not allowed to go see her ballet. I taught her how to swim when she was 2. She's a great swimmer. She's a great swimmer today. That was her safe place. In the water, underneath the water, nobody could touch her there. She was 12 when she got to come home. She had to go to this hospital to have like a surgery. Horrible deal. And I don't even want to go into that. But the father made sure that she didn't go to the hospital where they do a colposcope where they can tell what's going on. He just had her go to this other doctor, that hospital where they wouldn't do that colposcope. I was furious, and I can't explain what that was like. And they actually talked about taking the case number off the file so nobody could get to it. That's just totally illegal. So I fought like crazy. This is my book. I've got a lot of papers in here, but it's Prosecuted But Not Silenced: Courtroom Reform for Sexually Abused Children. I started writing my book when my daughter was 2, when I saw the system failing. So I wrote that book for 20 years. It wasn't just an overnight put it out there. I did it because I thought he may kill me and nobody'd ever know the truth. Like my daughter, I wrote it for her. I have this in my book, and my daughter wrote this when she's 12. I see an open ocean filled with mermaids. This still kills me. Anyway, I see an open ocean filled with mermaids diving in and out of the waves. I am a dreamer, lost in the world of order. I pretend to glide in and out of the clouds with a flying unicorn. I feel that when I enter my world, everything is peaceful. I touch the barrier between the dream world and reality. I worry that someday my special world will collide with the real. I say that my world will last forever. I dream that I'm on a star looking down at the world. I try to keep my two worlds from becoming one. I hope that my special world will never end, for it is my salvation from the troubles in life. I'm a dreamer, lost in the world of logic and order. So that tells you where she went. She dissociated in order to survive. Moms Fight Back is a nonprofit 501c3 and 4. I'm the executive director of Moms Fight Back, and what it's for is for protective moms trying to protect their children and pushing through legislation that will do that. Well, the main thing I would say that I didn't say is the training and education for judges, because the Constitution protected them from getting that training. And it's crucial that any judge that sits on the bench needs to understand domestic violence, child abuse, child sexual abuse, trauma, and coercive control. And that's huge. And then actually the training, like I said, for all the other professionals involved.